Here it is, okay. But it did occur to me that we've had a lot of talk about direct assessment and that people might be a little fuzzy on what it is exactly. Now, if you all know everything you want to know about direct assessment, you can just politely move towards the door. But I think it's a word that, or a phrase that gets used in many different ways. I also want to talk about some of the challenges involved in it and why, nonetheless, it's important. I know you haven't heard nearly enough about College for America, so I'll try and add a little more there. But so it is, first of all, a term of art in educational testing. So long before this particular regulation, right, people who worked in the field of educational measurement talked about direct assessment. And it was used to mean, in contrast to indirect assessment. So things like NESI, sometimes people talk about it as though it's assessment. It's actually perceptions by students of what they've learned rather than direct assessment of what they've learned. And I think, it's a little bit ironic that what we're trying to prove and we have to get special permission to do is direct assessment, but we're all happy to pay money for indirect assessment. So that tells you a little bit about where we are. That seems a bit odd. It's also, of course, a regulation. Originally created for Western Governors University, which doesn't actually use it. And I'll talk a little bit more about the regulation. And then finally, we'll talk why they don't. And then finally, it's sometimes used as a synonym for competency-based education. So which is it? Well, the truth is it's all of the above, right? But often I find that there's a lot of confusion, and so people sometimes will be talking about direct assessment when it has nothing to do with the regulation or federal financial aid. So bear with me a minute. I think Paul already alluded to this, as he alluded to most of the things on my slides. Never mind, I'm not bitter in any way. You look at the first part of the regulation, and it basically seems to say that students can get federal financial aid for programs that use direct assessment of student learning in lieu of credit hours and clock hours, right? So you say to yourself, oh, the clock is gone. But then you read a little further. And what you have to do is specify the equivalent number of credit hours or clock hours, right? So the clock comes back, basically. And I think it's that tension between the two that has both limited the effectiveness of this particular provision, or at least caused a certain amount of confusion and consternation about it. You also actually, if you apply for direct assessment, you have to get your accreditor to also sort of sign off that your methodology ensures that you have the equivalent of the credit hours. So I think that we're really right now in a very exciting time in higher ed, but we're certainly, I think, not done with this particular phase. So I would say we're in flux, and this regulation in some ways really, I think, captures that state of flux. So the problem, I think, I've just alluded to, but I want to spell out, is that this regulation, on the one hand, seems to promote innovation, right? You have a regulation from the, saying, oh, you can focus on student learning. You don't have to worry about seat time or clock hours. But at the same time, the translation back into clock hours means that you're still tethered to the credit hour, which, as Paul and everybody else today has said, may be fine for some things, but it's really a terrible proxy for learning, right? It doesn't give you very much information about learning. And Barbara Bringham did a wonderful, was on a panel today and spoke very eloquently about this and said, which I think is absolutely true, that most academics have a sort of inherent sense of how much a credit is worth, but that's really expert judgment. And when you move away and say to yourself, oh, you can get 3 credit hours for developmental math and 3 credit hours for a seminar in nuclear whatever, that tells you already that this inherent sense we have is very dependent on the type of school we teach at and the kind of program we're in. So as Paul also mentioned, the direct assessment, but no, let me try one more time. the experimental sites is supposed to give some relief from some of the problems with this regulation. So despite all of this, right, you could say to yourself, well, it really basically sounds like a pain. Why would you want to do it? And the reality is that direct assessment is about federal financial aid, right? I mean, it's a provision of Title IV of the Higher Education Act, and it's really what enables us to get our students money. And even though College for America is itself extremely low cost, it's $2,500 a year, all inclusive, some of our students still need help. So first and foremost, it was about our mission that we were committed to this CBE model, and we wanted to make sure our students who were eligible would get the federal financial aid they were entitled to. I think that competency focus is, I mean, some schools like Western Governors are both competency focused and course oriented. And for us, we really wanted to break away from the course as a defining unit. Because honestly, I think the course is a little bit like the credit hour. It's a sort of administrative container, but it's not about learning. I mean, you can make the semester shorter, you can make the semester longer, but at the end of the day, there's really nothing sacred about, you know, a 16-week experience or an 8-week experience or whatever. And the course is inherently instructor-focused and school-focused rather than learning-focused and learner-focused. So we really wanted to find a way to ensure that students had an opportunity to demonstrate what they knew and could do, and what they could do with what they knew, which is even more important, that wasn't constrained by courses. And so direct assessment was really the way to do this. Sorry, I didn't quite realize it would be behind me. Now, I do want to emphasize that there are many models. I'm with Mao on this. I think there should be 100 flowers and more blooming. I think that if you get sort of serious about competency-based education, what you're really doing is saying, you know, I'm agnostic as to how students develop competencies, but we care very much about how they demonstrate what they know, that we have evidence. And if you think about the legalistic name of this whole conference today, the case for competency-based education, I would say evidence has to be at the heart of it, right? So we are really about making sure that we can get the evidence we need to support the claims we're making about our graduates. And in our case, we use project-based learning, which is also doesn't really lend itself that well to the course structure. But we think actually that competencies are not the same thing as really micro student learning outcomes, that they're really about the application of knowledge and skills, right? So there's an inherent applied quality, and our projects, which are kind of authentic, really scenario-based assessment opportunities, really incorporate that applied quality, right? So that we don't really have tests for the most part. We will be giving some to benchmark our students' proficiency against that of others. But at the end of the day, I think that a competency is about something that you do that leverages what you know. And this is why we thought direct assessment was really the only way to go. And they've actually had a very good experience, despite all of the complaining and carrying on that you sometimes hear. We've had great relationships with the department and really benefited enormously from a very close working relationship with our regional accreditor. So now I will turn it over to Scott. And I think we'll fast forward with the, I don't know if you're up next or you don't have a...
No, he'll take care of it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Even though Capella and I are based in Minneapolis, it's delightful for me to be back here in Boston. New England, where I spent my college years and most of my 20s. And right about when, although that was many decades ago now, and so when I was leaving Boston back in the early 90s, was when Capella was getting started. And it was founded as a competency-based institution. And I want to talk a little bit more about that distinction between competency-based education and direct assessment But you've heard a lot about it this morning. Kate and Paul, I think, did a good job explaining it as well. So instead, I thought I'd run a little movie, a very short 2.5-minute video of how we explain that concept to learners and to prospects at Capella. Our average learner is 40 years old, and their experience with education is probably limited to bricks and mortar, credit hour based delivery models, or maybe online, but also credit hour based experiences. And so we're struggling to explain it here and make sure people within the academy have a good understanding of that. It can also be challenging and maybe off-putting or intimidating for working adults to understand that and then to opt in and adopt a model that is really innovative and different. So we'll run a short little video here about how we explain that to our learners.
This is you. You're hardworking, motivated, and ready to take the next step in your career. But you've reached a critical point in your journey. You need a degree to open more opportunities, delivered in a way that gives you more freedom, more control, and draws on your knowledge and experience to help you earn that degree more quickly. At Capella University, we can take you where you want to go with an entirely new pathway. We call it FlexPath. It's the latest, exciting, innovative way Capella is advancing higher education. FlexPath provides you with the same degree as a traditional program, but through a personalized learning approach that can help accelerate your professional success. What makes FlexPath so unique? It recognizes and flexes with the knowledge, skills, and experience you already possess. You complete an integrated series of competency assessments designed by our faculty who are experts in their fields. Once you finish an assessment, they'll review it and provide feedback within 48 hours. You're evaluated on how well you understand and apply theory through these assessments, which simulate the work you're expected to do on the job rather than through multiple choice exams. When you demonstrate mastery of the subject matter, you move forward. It's a win-win scenario. Your learning benefits your job, and your real-world experience benefits your degree. FlexPath also flexes because it's self-paced. We understand that you're a busy working professional, so there are no pre-established weekly timelines or deadlines. You complete the required assessments at your pace by the end of the term. Using your professional experience to finish these assessments allows you to move more quickly through subjects in which you're already proficient, which reduces your overall tuition cost and speeds up your completion time. And while you're in charge of your own learning, you're never alone. Our strong support structure is in place to help you stay on track. Not only do you benefit on a personal level, your employer will be impressed by the skills and knowledge you gain and can apply toward your job. In fact, they've told us they prefer Capella's competency-based approach and assessments to objective exams. It gives them confidence that you understand a specific area of study and have proven your ability to apply that learning. This is you. This is your opportunity. This is your path. Learn more about how this innovative program is changing the face of education and how you can be a part of it.
So I apologize for the marketing nature of the video, but the point is that the concept of holding expectations for learning constant and varying the time is a really disruptive concept in higher education. And those don't come around all that often. And it's not only raises the kind of thing that raises confusion or the potential for confusion and concerns within higher education, but it also can be confusing to prospects and to learners as well. So part of how Southern New Hampshire, Western Governors, Capella help to grow the credibility of this category is to make sure that that concept is clear, and it isn't a fully credentialed, the same degree that you would get if you were taking credit hour based program at Capella. So a couple things I want to highlight around direct assessment, and then I'll talk a little bit about cost as well. But one is that in Capella's model, we really do put the faculty at the center of it. So there can be confusion around that point. In fact, there was an article in the Chronicle this morning that mentioned Southern New Hampshire and Capella as having, I think the quote was low faculty input or something like that. And actually, that's not the case at all. Our faculty do the assessment using authentic assessment methodology of the competencies that the learners are demonstrating. And what we found is that even our own faculty who opted into an online-centric, teaching-centered model at a for-profit university at first thought that was a concern, and they were a little bit worried about that. What we're finding is that the faculty that have been doing it really love the work that they do. It sort of takes away some of the things that they didn't like as much that might be described as lower value added task for faculty, and allows them to focus on really assessing, has this learner mastered this competency or not, and if not, why not, and how can I be helpful to them? And it's really what they love to do in teaching. So having the faculty at the center of the design and the execution has been an important part of how we thought about it at Capella. Another thing to think about is the opportunity that this unlocks in terms of pricing models, and I think that has been mentioned in a couple of the sessions today as well. When you vary time and you hold the expectations for learning constant, a couple things happen. We actually expected the greatest response from learners to be the ability to accelerate, the ability to move a lot faster, because since you're paying for a block of time, in this initial case because of the Title IV issues, a block of 13 weeks, which at Capella, depending on the program, is around $2,000 a quarter. But you can move as fast as you're able to demonstrate you've mastered those competencies. We thought that would be the greatest value to our learners. In fact, what they value, and there certainly are some, by the way, who move rapidly. They've got the time, they've got the capability to do that. And with adult learners, they, unlike, say, 18 to 22-year-olds, they really want to have their prior expertise that they've developed over 10, 15, 20, 25 years of hard work to be honored and valued. And that's important for adults, less important for young adults. And so the ability to control that pacing, go faster through the things that they understand better and when they have time available in their busy schedules, and move more deliberately or more slowly if it's foreign material that they need to master, that it takes longer to master, and or they just don't have the time available in their busy schedules. That control is the greatest value, and it makes a whole lot of sense. You could argue it makes a lot of sense for anybody. It certainly makes sense for really busy 40-year-old mid-career adults. And so when it comes to pricing and cost, not only moving faster is going to allow you to save time and cost, but you can start using innovative pricing models where you pay for different blocks of time. You could pay for a year, you could pay for different periods of time. And because this is so tied to industries and employers and to employment, you create a new value proposition directly with employers where they're willing to underwrite and pay for a lot of these programs in a way where their tuition assistance programs, their tuition reimbursement, that seem much more as just kind of a benefit like parking in the garage or health benefits. So the direct assessment model, and we've been at it about a year as well. We launched last October at the bachelor's and master's level. Capella is historically a graduate school. We started as a PhD-only institution, moved into master's degrees and professional doctorates, and more recently added undergraduate degrees. So the application of direct assessment is not only valuable at, say, the associate's level or getting into bachelor's, but bachelor's and master's and potentially into professional doctorate space as well. So I think as more and more schools build on a competency-based infrastructure to offer direct assessment, I think that will lend a lot of additional credibility and take away some of the initial concerns, especially if we're measuring outcomes. If we're measuring solid outcomes and the pathway there can be at different times, it works differently for different people, but you're measuring the quality of the outcomes, then I think you can stand behind that as a really high quality offer. Thank you. Sally.
May I have the magic clicker here? Figure out how it works. We'll find out. Let's see. Voila. Sometimes the magic does work. I'm just going to, since we're here in the wilds of New England, I'm sure most of you may have heard the words Western Governors University, but you may not know what it is. And thank you, sir. We'll get this mic a little less hot. We really were founded by a bunch of Western governors. I was part of that design team while I was at WICHE, which is NEBI's sister organization in the Western states. Our students not only fit the profile that we've been talking about here today, but in addition to that, over half of our students are Pell eligible. So these are folks that they're not necessarily the people that would go to elite institutions. We currently have about 50,000 students with over 30,000 degrees awarded, and that's in the last 17, 18 years. And by the way, we do run on a subscription model that's under $6,000 a year, and we've not raised that tuition in, I'm not sure if it's 7 or 8 years at this point. So we keep it all moving and growing and constantly checking on the quality and efficacy of these degrees for our students. But that's not the focus of our panel. This is just a map, I hope, yes, of the distribution of our students. So you get a sense that we're everywhere. Every place we are, we're licensed to be there, including in the great state of Massachusetts, which in all honesty, the licensure to operate in the great state of, or excuse me, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was more expensive than regional accreditation, but we won't go there. The original legislation that enabled direct assessment, as Kate mentioned, was originally designed for Western Governors University. And once it was put into place, we quickly realized it wasn't going to be worth going in that direction. Now, when we first designed WGU, it was not what we think of now as course-based. It was a very abstract concept of clustering learning opportunities into chunks or bundles that didn't quite look like courses, but we had to have a way to map it back to credit hours. So we have a complex formula that, you know, does this and lets us dance back and forth. But very quickly, as our student enrollment began to grow, we got loud and clearly from our students the message that they needed to be able to transfer courses in, and they also needed to be able to transfer courses out. As it turns out, since the inception and original design of WGU, those things we call chunks of learning have become more and more closely aligned with what our traditional institutions do and call a 3 credit hour course. That doesn't mean all of our courses are 3 credit hours. In fact, we don't even use the words credit hours. We use competency units, but they map very directly into credit hours, which facilitates the movement of students both into the institution and beyond the institution, whether it's into grad school or whether it is this isn't working for them and they want to go to a more traditional environment. For the last 2 years, I've been working with a team of community colleges across the country as they've developed their own competency-based programs. We were going to talk a little bit about cost issues. And I would suggest that there's a variety of cost issues that you have to really think about. And one of them is certainly those startup costs. And those can be substantial or less substantial. We're working with a team of colleges, some of whom got a couple of $1 million in grant funding to get going. They were able to move faster. Then we worked with another group of colleges that didn't have that sort of resource and had to find resources within their institution. And the estimate I'm getting from these community colleges at this point for base startup is between $200,000 and $300,000 that needs to be set aside with a long-term sense of we're not going to recoup this in a year. It will take many years to get to that point. The other piece of the costing issue is then What are the parameters around your costs for sustaining a program? Setting aside the startup costs and saying, okay, this is an investment. Now, what does it take to keep this thing going? And as I mentioned, at WGU, we run a subscription model, and all you can eat, much as both of these institutions represented on the stage do as well. And we can keep our tuition constant because we've arranged a framework to support those students that becomes cost effective. And by the way, all 1,200, or I think it's up to 1,300 now, of our faculty are all full-time. And the faculty models, I think, are also very interesting. And within these community colleges, we found that they're using different kinds of models. In some cases, all of them had indigenous frameworks that they were working with, and they relied on their faculty to do different kinds of things. At Broward College in Florida, they split their faculty up in teams, had 2 of the 3 faculty all agreed on what were the learning outcomes for a particular course. Students were going to be able to move through these courses at a variable pace. They'd have 2 faculty then work on either developing or finding the learning resources, and a 3rd faculty member developing the assessments. And then actually a 4th person that made sure they were all aligned. Lots of different models around this, but the upshot of it is faculty do need to be the core of what's going on in terms of creating and setting that curriculum, and I don't think I would find disagreement from either of my colleagues up here. But then they work differently with students, and that's part of the very interesting piece of this. Now, theoretically, on Monday of next week, and I just got word that, yep, we're there, we're going to be launching this website. It's not about WGU, it's about the lessons learned by these 10 community colleges that are contributing to this, on what they did, how they did it, what they stumbled at, and what went on as they gained enrollment to enable them to get to now over 3,000 students enrolled. A couple of more things. Oops. Oh, I took those out. Sorry. Let me just mention this then in terms of some of the costing things. As you move into sustainability, one of the critical aspects of thinking about what your model is you have to be sure you're using any one-time funding for really the creation of your assets. Okay? So if you're setting aside or you have grant funding or anything else, you want to use that to create learning resources or assessments or those kinds of things that will have to be part of your operational activities but are extraordinary resources to start with. As you then move towards sustainability, you want to be sure you've designed a model so that your fixed costs are either very low or they're spread out over a lot of students. And at WGU, we've managed to kind of do both. For these community colleges that we've been working with, in one case in the state of Washington, as they got up and going, we had 4 independent colleges, all community colleges, but scattered across the state doing these things independently. And as they began working, they realized, you know, this is silly. We're never in our own little community going to be able to generate the kinds of student numbers that we need to sustain this over a long period of time. So in the state of Washington, there is now, I'm not sure if it's 6 or a dozen, I get different answers from different people, that are working, colleges that are working together, and they're creating a statewide competency-based associate program with the idea that they'll be able to share costs both for startup and then eventually in sustainability, they'll be able to share the tuition that comes in from the students. The whole notion of the cost framework here has to do with really creating a business model that differentiates competency-based education from what we traditionally do in a campus environment. So in a campus environment, which is, and even in online environments very typically, there's a set number of students that will work with an individual faculty member who will then create the materials, teach the classes, assess the students. And for every extra 50 students that come in, you have to increase your costs by the same amount that it took you to serve 30 students or 20 students. It's always a stepwise function. And when we move into a CBE program, you create environments in which Your sustaining costs are more of a flat, smooth function that changes not with every chunk of students, but with students over time. And it's not impossible to do, but it does take rethinking the way in which people who are working on the student support side of things are doing so, and the nature of the people that you have directly supporting students so that you can sustain larger numbers and maintain a lower cost. There's a lot more to this and a lot of interesting things about it, and that website that I had up there a few minutes ago, cbeinfo.org, is where the new work we're doing on costing, we'll put it up there. We'll also get it out to anybody that wants to listen. But the framework around this is we're trying very hard to take the lessons that others have learned and get them out in usable ways. And that CBE Info website will be one in which you can post questions, and we'll monitor it and we'll contact folks at the colleges to get responses back to you. And I'm going to stop there and turn this back to our moderator, or better yet, to the guru who made all of this happen.
Will you join me in thanking all of our presenters? We've got lots of time for questions because we're ending their presentations a little bit early. So if you have a question, would you step to either one of the mics, identify yourself? Anybody? Oh, come on.
All right, we have an eager volunteer.
So can you hear me? Okay, so I'm the coordinator of prior learning assessment at Middlesex Community College. And so it's sort of a CBE-based model of, portfolios and exams or interviews or something like that. But it's for prior learning. And so I'm struggling with how the translation and the relationship between prior learning assessment, where they've already got the learning, and you're doing the CBE, and how your students get the learning, and how the learning takes place, and to which it ends with a sort of a CBE like we do with prior learning. Did you
Can I
understand
start,
what
or
I'm...
you guys want to start?
I'll go ahead and so there are a lot of overlaps between the institutional capabilities in having a progressive, well-designed PLA set of processes and competency assessment or direct assessment. And I think that in a competency-based model, often you can be agnostic as to the source of the learning. So whether the learner has already acquired that learning or they're going through a process, whether they use content that you make available to them or that they could attend a MOOC, they could do any number of things. That process of assessing have they mastered these competencies or not is not dissimilar from a really robust prior learning assessment process. But what it does is it builds an entire infrastructure and scaffolding around that, around the entire degree program. But the actual process of assessing the mastery of the competencies, depending on how you set it up, is not necessarily a completely different process.
Let me respond to that. If you think about it, traditionally PLA is really about credit, right, as opposed to competency. So you really have somebody who, sort of, because adult learners are not blank slates, they come into higher education with a variety of experiences and expertise and knowledge and so on. So PLA is really, in some ways, in a traditional environment, an attempt to capture that, to say, you're not a blank slate, let's bring in to your credits, or your transcript, some acknowledgement that you came here already knowing some things. Competency-based education, at least as we do it at CFA, is actually it's really not about credits. So you can do our assessments more quickly if you already have prior competency, right? But we actually don't care about giving credit because what we're doing is providing an opportunity to demonstrate the competency. Now, you asked, in your question was another piece, which is, well, how are people developing these competencies? And what you didn't see was, what we have is actually an LMS that we developed that enables students to, gives a lot of resources, typically OER, to lower the cost, but they're very carefully curated and sometimes created as well, so that each of these projects contains links to very specifically chosen videos or text-based or sort of other types of resources, so that students, first of all, don't get hideous textbook fees, but also because they're able to develop the competencies if they don't already have them. So we're keeping sort of steady the demonstration of the competencies, but we're really agnostic as to what you came in with, if that makes sense.
Let me start from that piece and go back to the initial part of your question. At WGU, we include the learning resources, which are course-based and frequently personalized learning environments in our tuition. So a student isn't buying a textbook either online or whatever. It's built into the cost of being a student. We don't require students to use those, but boy, do we track carefully what they use and how they use it. And in fact, our agreements with the producers are basically based on, who's used it and for how long and how it works. So that's how they're getting information. However, let me take the concept that both Kate and Scott just mentioned and give you a concrete example. So if a student has been working in the field of databases for 5-6 years, and they know this stuff, and they come into WGU and they're interested in learning or earning, a bachelor's degree in database management. Well, they come in and their faculty member is going to initially say, look, why don't you go ahead and work through these initial courses? And those initial courses are going to be all about databases. And here's a human being that already knows that. So she goes in, takes a look at it. She might do a pre-assessment to see if she's got any gaps. She may move through some of the initial courses in a month and earn, in our case, it's course-based, so they're going to earn competency units and progress in that way and have to master them at least a B level. But they're going to be taking the same assessments that any student who's at WGU would take. And they're going to have to demonstrate the same activities. And if they can do that, they can move right on. Now, we do try to guard against allowing that to happen if later in the degree we're not also re-examining whether or not the student really knows it. So it's not like they come in and, oh, got it, move on, and we'll never get back to that. We're careful about folding back into that knowledge base later in the student's development as a matriculating student. So at a junior or senior level, which, whatever we want to call those things, the upper level courses, they're going to go back and assure that the student actually knows what he or she came in with. But it is, in all of the models that we have, the notion that instead of demonstrating or having a product that demonstrates the translation of your skills and knowledge into your credits or however you're going to, whatever you call these things, we instead just built it into the whole process. So you accelerate based on what you already know, but you're going through the same kinds of experiences that any student would go through, just you're doing it faster.
But if you have to learn, if you need to develop the competencies, then you're taking
courses.
sort of a traditional course.
Well, sure.
Not
Well,
first, yeah.
that I shouldn't use traditional, but
It's a course.
You do have, because I'm trying to imagine, I think I kind of get this competency-based education assessment because of the work I've done, but what I find over and over is students come in and they don't really want to have to demonstrate their competency. They want you to sit there, they actually come into my office and they just
Yeah.
want me to write off the credits
Right,
based on a
I know.
5-minute conversation, right? And then, so I suggest some to go to Learning Counts, for example, where they might have to take a course just on how to prepare a portfolio, then prepare a portfolio. Almost no one ever goes to the
I
trouble.
know.
They need the discipline of seat time And I'm wondering how
So-
you could comment on how you get.
Yeah.
I know there's students out there who do have the discipline, but an awful
No, no,
lot
no, we
do not.
don't, well, it's why I mentioned half our students are Pell eligible, and I think the average, our registrar tells me the average student comes to WGU with 3 different transcripts that we have to evaluate and figure out what they get credit for and what they don't. Usually it's 1 or 2 courses on those transcripts. But the issue is, we ask that all students, go through courses. Now, they go through those courses that are individually designed, that is, they're designed to do on your own, but they're in weekly contact with a faculty member, and they're working in distributed groups with other students to master the materials that are in the course. So it's a very high-touch environment, but it's not a person lecturing to them. And if they already have the knowledge, they can go through it as quickly as they want to. And if they're starting from scratch, they're going to be slower, and they're going to use more of what I would call our faculty resources in terms of tutoring or guidance that will help them master what they need to master.
And I think it's critical to remember that a competency-based, self-paced mastery model is not going to work well for everybody. There are segments of the market that are going to need the discipline of a schedule and deadlines, and there will be other segments where they need the hands-on instruction that accompanies being able to demonstrate your mastery of competencies. This is a kind of model that is going to work well for certain segments of the student population, particularly subsegments of working adults, who don't want to have to pay for instruction for competencies that they bring to the table.
So I want to push back on that a little, because I actually think our model is enormously engaging and in some ways a wonderful alternative to the disenchanted, disaffected students sitting in the back of the class hoping for a C-, right? I mean, our students are, first of all, doing things that are engaging and interesting and relevant and fun. I think technology really gives them enormous amounts of information about how they're doing. So our students get feedback, as Paul mentioned, within sometimes 30 hours. That includes time for sleep, right, on how they've done. And there's an element of gamification in the sense that they all have dashboards. They can see how close they are moving towards graduation. We have students who are checking their smartphones every 2 minutes to see whether they got their feedback, which is very different from the student who forgets to pick up their graded paper because, the semester is over and they don't care. The other thing is that because we have a mastery model, as Paul described, it's not a once and done, right? So they're engaged in an ongoing process of learning and demonstrating what they know and can do, so that you may submit your work the first time and not actually satisfy all the criteria, right? So then they're talking to their reviewers, the faculty equivalents who are evaluating their work, and they really have a much more sort of personalized type of dialogue about what they need to develop than I think most students get in a traditional faculty situation, in which, you pick up your paper, it says, some things you can't read, there's a grade at the top, and it's not connected to any further learning, right? It's sort of just a one and done. So I think it's a really very different mindset.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Avery from Wheelock College. One of the things that I want to just get my brain around is this idea. I understand, I hear you all saying, it makes a lot of sense to me about the individualized element of it. But and that I can imagine how in courses there would be opportunity to do teamwork with the other people that are taking the same learning at the same time. But I guess I'm wondering about more like the idea of a cohort, and if it's self-paced. Is there any sense that, and I keep thinking about, I have my brain around the person who wants to go quicker, but the person who's not able to go quicker, and maybe the folks that they were starting to work with now have all moved on, and so I'm just wondering about that idea. Is there a sense of cohort? Is that just not really thought about it in a different way? And is there any sense of helping people think about their own pacing and not be caught out as someone doing it differently than everybody else and not feeling connected?
Sure. I would look up on that website next week when it comes out. There's some wonderful approaches to pacing that our community college partners independently came up with, and they're different, but they'll be up there and you can take a look at them, or you can, ask questions about them.
The info.org.
Yeah. But the other part of that is we manage cohort groups in certain classes because of scale. So when a student is working on a course and he or she, it's 3 in the morning and he or she comes up with something that's going on, or they've got they want to arrange things, they've got a dashboard that lets them know who else is online at that moment working on that course. And it doesn't give them their name, but they can connect with them and do things like that. But in some of our courses, we actually require cohort arrangements. But it is done in a framework of, because you've got enough students that are doing it, there's always going to be a few that are in the same place at the same time.
And there's such good social networking type tools available that you can build into a online course room environment. You've got some learners who really just want help. Hey, have you found content that was helpful for this? So it's sort of subject-based or topic-based, and others who just need the motivational support, and others who don't really care for either. And so what we found is as we built these sorts of capabilities in, because it can be an isolating experience for some, and but it doesn't have to. We're finding some really take advantage of it, others happy to not take advantage of those tools, but having both the opportunity for motivational support as well as advice around where to go, how to get things done. It's an important part of the model, I think, for the future.
I also, in the case of College for America, the vast majority of our students come in through employers, actually, rather than sort of off the street. And so there are these natural cohorts because of that, and the fact that sometimes they'll be working together in a break room or at some other time. But what's interesting is our students actually have to find their own teammates, and that itself is actually a very useful competency to develop. But I was talking a bit about the fact that there's sometimes, this person is in this time zone and, this person is another time zone. And, every time I mention this, people say, oh, at the work I do, we're working with, developers from Uruguay and, and some person is in, Alabama, and we have to figure out a time together. So I think that itself is very authentic. The needing to, collaborate virtually is a real, honest-to-goodness competency all on its own.
And you haven't felt the need to monitor those in any way?
But we monitor the heck out of everything. I mean,
Okay.
it's one of the wonderful things about the online environment is that we have incredible optics into, how our students are doing, are they forming groups, how many times does it take them to master a given set of competencies, and so on. So it's actually, I'm a recovering academic, and I can tell you that I have much more information about these students than I ever did as a professor.
That's really helpful, thank you.
The other thing on the monitoring that we've started doing, which I think is just fascinating, is we not only do everything you'd think about, but because we have these relationships with our providers of the learning resources, we can track how people are moving through the learning resources. And within 15 minutes of a student working with that course material, we can tell whether or not they are likely to be successful or not because of their pattern of working with the materials. Now, the question around that, and I think this is a really cool, interesting thing, the question around it is, what do you do with that information? Do you call the student up and say, hey, the way you've always done this in the past is going to result in the likelihood you're not going to be successful? No, you don't do that. So what we're doing with it is tracking it very closely, and we're turning around and giving it back to the people that are creating these learning resources for us and saying, hey, did you know? Because they could, but they don't track it. So because it's in our best interest to have that done, we give it back to them and say, look, pay attention.
Richard Parent from the University of New England. Sort of following up on that, a lot of with the data that we have, and we know that the support we have to give these students means we're doing a lot of direct assessment of their actual work product while they're doing the work of their courses or competencies or whatever. For especially the subscription model universities, how have you set metrics for successful, sufficient progress through a self-paced model that way?
So I just want to say, I mean, one of the things about direct assessment in the federal sense, right, is that there are certain requirements that come with that. So in order to receive federal financial aid, for the next semester, a student has to demonstrate satisfactory academic progress. And this is not actually as simple as it seems, because traditionally what you do is measure what percentage of courses attempted to courses completed. But in a competency model, you want students to attempt as much as they can. So that particular percentage ratio idea doesn't work. So what we did, and the department agreed with it, was to look at a percentage of full-time status and say that is satisfactory academic progress for the purposes of College for America. But you know, in my ideal universe, there would be probably a little more elasticity around that. Somebody asked before about self-paced, and I'm sure this is true for my colleagues here. Our students schedule their own work, and they can reschedule it if they want, but then their coach will say, oh, you rescheduled that 3 times, what's going on? So I would say it's not no pace, right? It's sort of flexibly paced, and I think that is one of the things that work so well.
And these are some of the things that I think are going to evolve a lot in the experimental site
Yes.
results and beyond, where in order to demonstrate satisfactory academic progress, sometimes you have to do things that don't add value to the student or to the learning, and other times they can. So intervening, hey, noticed you haven't been following your own schedule, that engagement is part of checking in with them on a regular basis. I think you can't go multiple weeks without any interaction, and that's not a good thing anyway. And so if you can design it in a way where you're helping improve the experience for the learner and you're satisfying the requirement, that makes sense.
That would be ideal, yeah.